All right, welcome back, Senator. We're back on air. This is Daybreak. You're watching Citizen TV. It's now 7:06 on the 1st of April 2018. Just to reintroduce our panel, Mheshimiwa Rigathi Gachagua from Mathira constituency, Senator Moses Kajwang from Homa Bay, Senator Irungu Kang'ata from Murang'a, and Senator Ledama Ole Kina from Narok. We take a look at story, the front page, page 9 of the Standard, that you'll see 3 stories that are related to Kimorel and Arrow dams. You see the stolen dam vehicles wanted for exhibits. Missing vehicles are KCN 098G a Prado, KCN 097G a Prado, KCN 966F a Prado, KCN 960F a Prado, KCP 753Z a Prado, KCN 096G Toyota double cabin, KCN 133N Toyota double cabin, KCN 139N Toyota double cabin, and KCN 456G a Land Cruiser pickup. And then the country Kenya at a risky borrower, according to an Italian firm, and Kenya, according to the Italian government-owned insurer, says it ranks just a point above the worst profile of borrowers at 6 out of 7. So I know that the investigations are continuing. We have this report that these vehicles are being looked for, and there's a call that members of the public, should they cite it, they can report the nearest police station. But I'm just wondering, with this kind of rating, how then does it affect our ability to finance our budget, bearing in mind that we've been getting quite a big portion, a big chunk of that financing from borrowing, whether it's domestic or foreign?
I think the first question we have to examine is whether we as a country are a risky borrower. And I would actually agree with the Italian firm. Because we are a risky borrower because, one, our ability to pay back, you know, if we're talking about doing away with corruption entirely and being honest about it, then of course we are an industrial economy which can be able to do what? To pay its debt. But the problem is that we have no ceilings on our borrowing. Right now I read a story that the president is heading to China to borrow another 380 billion shillings. And I asked myself, really, where are our priorities? If we continue borrowing on a daily basis, how else are we going to be able to sustain this economy? I think one of the most important thing that we must do now is to try and find solutions to those. And the solutions will come in by us admitting that we cannot be able to continue living the lie. You know, we have to make sure that we live within our means. We are borrowing too much, we are stealing too much. So of course, those are the characteristics of a risky borrower. You know, in the way that if we have to borrow a loan for us to be able to pay another loan, it is ridiculous. I used to work for one company that I'm not going to mention, and that company had a huge loan that they had taken from one financial institution, and then they had another short-term loan to be able to finance the big loan that they have taken. That is exactly what we are doing. We are syndicating loans. We are also issuing bonds to be able to continue paying our debt. That is very risky, and we ought to stay away from that.
Senator Kang'ata, do you feel the same? I recall that on December 20th, 2018, the president spoke to journalists and said that we are currently safe in terms of borrowing, because at that time it was 57% of the GDP, and he was saying that economies like Japan have gone beyond that and they're still sustainable. So do you think we are at that risky point, and what need we do to control the trend that we are now pursuing?
Yes, it is true what the president said. He was correct in the sense that there are ways of measuring a country which is highly indebted or not. Let's say like America is very highly indebted. Places like Japan, they supersede 100% of their GDP to debt ratio. So Kenya, we still have some leg up, a place where we can continue borrowing against our assets. But on the other hand, for me, I tend to be a fiscal conservative. That is, I don't really support what we call deficit budgets. That is where you, for instance, you have lower revenue vis-a-vis what you want to expend. That gap is what we call a deficit in the budget. So Kenya, for the last several years, we have had that deficit for a very long time. At times it is 10%, at times it's 7%. For me, I tend to support what we call a balanced budget. And because that then means, for instance, the country is not going to do domestic borrowing when the state does not borrow domestically, interest rates of our banks tends to go down because the government is not competing with private sector to borrow money. And once that happens, money is freed up to the private sector, and the growth is then geared up by the private sector. But currently, you find we capped the interest rates, but then we proceeded to continue borrowing domestically. So banks are preferring to lend to the government because the government is a less risk, has a less risk profile as opposed to lending to the private sector. As a result, you hear people saying there's no money circulating in the economy. So for me, I would have voted for what we call a balanced budget. It's more rational. It ensures growth for a longer period. However, I also know assets is equals to capital plus liabilities.
Right.
So therefore, at times, you can't grow without taking some risk of borrowing.
Senator Kajwang, when a country is referred to as a highly risky borrower, what sort of, that kind of poor rating, what does it do to the country's economy and more so to the common pockets of the common mwananchi?
If a country is tagged as a risky borrower, it means even the cost of credit on international markets will be much higher. But I see Kenya more of an irresponsible borrower than a risky borrower, because the risk then would point to the fact that the country might default. I don't know whether Kenya has gotten to a point where there's a risk of default. I see Kenya as irresponsible in this sense, that we have floated Eurobonds in the past and raised billions of Kenya shillings and billions of dollars. But you remember the conversation a few years ago, where we challenged the government of the day to quantify and identify the projects that had been supported by that Eurobond. To date, you wouldn't find anyone telling you, pointing out, saying that this road was built by Eurobond, or this airport was built by Eurobond, and it was 250 billion Kenya shillings, whose repayment is almost due. That is irresponsible borrowing. We read over the weekend about some contractors from Hong Kong who were supposed to drill some rigs for geothermal GDC.
But didn't even show up to the site.
But didn't even show up.
Right.
And that was a financed kind of arrangement. That is irresponsible borrowing. At the end of the day, the person who's going to bear this pressure is a common man. And right now, if you look at the average debt per capita, every Kenyan, including that one living in Kibra, owes almost $900. $900. And I can tell you many Kenyans don't have that kind of money in their pocket, in their bank account, or buried somewhere else.
Right.
So we are irresponsible. Finally, when the president sometimes equates Kenya to Japan and other economies, I think he's missing the point by a mile. We have been using World Bank and IMF benchmarks to assure ourselves that our debt ratios or thresholds are still okay. But an analysis by the Parliamentary Budget Office that was presented to us when we are looking at the last budget policy statement indicates that the thresholds defined in the PFM, Public Finance Management Act, indicates that Kenya is in the red. We should not be using IMF and World Bank measures. We should be using the measures that have been defined in the legislation that has been enacted in this country.
Right. Honorable Rigathi, when we talk about other economies in other countries, let's use perhaps the most current country-to-country relationship that we've seen. Last week, we saw President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda here in Kenya. We gave them land in Naivasha. We are going to import more sugar from 36,000 tons to about 90,000 tons. They get to also import more eggs and more chickens. What did Kenya get out from that meeting that we saw last week?
Well, that matter is very current. I came from up country last night, and our people are yet to understand what happened. But from the face of it, they think we got a road deal.
We got a road deal.
They think we got a road deal because they are yet to appreciate what are the gains that we got by allowing Uganda to bring eggs, to bring this and that. But be as it may, we must borrow because nobody can grow without borrowing, including ourselves, including you, Sam. You have a circle here, and once in a while you take some money. What I have a problem with myself, with the proposed loan of 380 billion for SGR, is the lessons we had from the 340 billion for phase 1 from Mombasa to Nairobi. I have a big problem with borrowing money from China or from elsewhere, and they come with a full package. They bring all the materials, they bring all the supplies, they bring all the workers, they bring everything, and then repatriate the profits. And they only leave us with the railway line and nothing else. Why there is a problem of money circulation in this country? Are these monies coming from outside? Because they come tied. It's an entire deal. They bring the money, the supplies, the workers, and they take away the profit. So you find money is not circulating.
Who is to blame for Kenya getting the short end of the stick?
I think when we are negotiating these agreements, I think in our desperation to get money into the country, sometimes we don't go through the lines, the dotted lines properly. And I think the people who are giving us the money, they give us an agreement that is very skewed in their favor. But to a point where they just give you the money and then they take away the entire amount. And in the process, they leave you with a line. But at that time, and this is money that we shall pay, there is no money circulating. If you go to walk to the streets of Nairobi today, everybody is complaining. There's no money in circulation. You are aware of that. Because an entire 340 billion is injected into the economy and then it's gotten out.
But Mheshimiwa Gachagua, I mean, the gentleman at the National Treasury, Henry Rotich, has been at the helm since 2013. It's 6 years, going to 7 years now.
Yes.
And he has had this experience signing all these deals and seeing the kind of the fine print.
Yes.
He has read it.
Yes.
There has been all this noise coming from everyone, from the political class to citizenry, but we still don't pick out those lessons. Is it arrogance or we just don't get it? Why shouldn't we? Why are we not able to see those things and implement
I think from where I sit, I belong to the school of thought that in our 2010 constitution we made a mistake of bringing technocrats into government, people who have no feedback mechanism from the Kenyans. See, today, if I was Minister for Finance, I will be receiving those feedback mechanisms from my constituents, and it will inform my decisions. You know, you saw last week some people in the Ministry of Agriculture making some ridiculous propositions that we should not use manure to do our farms. you know, because they have no touch with the reality of what goes on. Somebody making a ridiculous regulation that when I milk my cow, I cannot take the milk directly. I take it to the factory for packaging. Then I go, I buy, and then I consume it at
a higher price.
At 4 times the price. Yes. Because these guys now, the technocrats, the CSs, they are living in a world of their own. They're just there. And there is no way anybody can reach them to give them a feedback mechanism.
I see
including Parliament?
No, I see it differently. I don't think we made a mistake in bringing technocrats. I say so because currently when we have the governors and the county governments, they are politicians. And the way they are running, the way they are coming up with their budgets, they are overestimating, first of all, their local own source revenue. That's number one. If you look at even the trend, even in the national government, the same problems we're having is that we can never have what Kangata said, the balanced budget. Every year, we must have 2, 3, or 4 supplementary budgets. You know, when we were in Samburu recently, the governor there was actually blaming the control of budget, saying the control of budget was withholding about 6 billion of his money. And when you actually sit down and analyze all this, is that he overestimated his own source revenue. And then constantly he carries out supplementary. This is the same problem. So I don't think that it is the technocrats who are actually misguided. I think what is happening is that we have we overestimate our own source revenue nationally, you know, from the national government. It trickles down to the county government, and then constantly what we do is that because we can never go through a financial year without a supplementary budget, of course we see all these problems. I don't believe that having a politician there will ease the burden in the Kenyans.
My point center, if I might clarify, my point center was, if today you are Minister for Agriculture and the regulations are brought before you saying that people should first take their milk for packaging before they can buy, you not allow it because you are always with the people and you know exactly how people live and you understand the way the traditional setup in Narok, and where you cannot bring too much government into people's lives. Government is to give services, it's to build roads, water, electricity, but a government cannot get in too much into people's lives, where you want to control even how they deal with their neighbors. If it was somebody elected who is in that office, He will not allow that kind of nonsense to go through.
Senator, before you say something, there's a caller called Joshua from Murang'a, so let's listen to him. Joshua, good morning. What's your question or comment on this conversation?
Morning.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I want to appeal to our leaders and especially the panelists. I can see we have very sharp and intelligent leaders to just tell this nation the truth. The reason why we are having all these problems in terms of borrowing, the economy going down, is because of poor governance and greed and graft. Why do I say that? I'm saying this because the reason why we are overborrowing, we are scared to be overborrowing, is because we are borrowing loans that have incentives attached to them. This money, I mean, going back, the kickbacks that comes back to the government officials. I bet there are so many countries that are willing to give loans to nations, but most of these loans are conditional. But we don't want to take loans that are conditional, whereby we'll be told that this money must be put to good use, there must be transparency, there must be accountability, and they must go to this particular project. So we run to countries that compromise on integrity, get money, and get huge kickbacks, which have become a burden to the country when it comes back to borrowing. And finally, in terms of, talking about our economy not doing so well, we are simply importing everything. Why can't we just be candid enough and say that whatever can be manufactured locally should not be imported from outside? Why are we talking about Uganda and eggs and all this? They are just they cater well for the interests of their nations. But for us, we are more concerned about what comes to our individual pockets. I think greed, graft is ruining this nation.
All right, thank you so much, Joshua, calling from Murang'a. He raises a few points in regards to why we are borrowing. Greed, graft, is it true? And I recall that when SGR Phase 1 from Mombasa to Nairobi was being built, there was a report from the Ministry of Transport that indicated that there was several tons of cement that were made locally. I don't know whether that counts as part of what's locally available, but is it true that you're pursuing greed, graft, and kickbacks?
Well, 3 issues he has raised. Number one, it is true we need to fight corruption. To me, that's key, and I think the president is doing something about that. Number 2, on the issue concerning whether we can ban imports, we will be going against the World Trade Organization rules. The philosophy behind WTO is to facilitate trade. So therefore, once you block that, then your exports will also be blocked. There will be what we call reciprocal retaliation from the other countries, and that will not be very positive for us. So the idea of WTO is you concentrate in areas that you have a competitive edge over your neighboring countries. But most importantly, I see an ideological spin into this discussion. When it's come to development, there are 2 different schools of thought. There's those who argue, no, you need to put more emphasis on infrastructure. That is, you build more roads, you build more railway, you build more airports, for instance. But there's also another school of thought that argues you put more resources in the human person, that is education, health, income. So therefore, you will find, when you look at Rotich, he seems to belong to the school of thought that will go ahead through infrastructure methodology. The problem with that, it tends to be more manipulable to corruption, amenable to corruption. Number 2, it tends to concentrate the benefits to a certain region. For instance, the SGR, the first beneficiary will be those people along that railway. Of course, there is what is called trickle-down effect, but all facts are being constant. There is a notion of concentration. For me, I would probably belong to the school of thought of human-centered development. That is, when you invest, for instance, free public secondary education, every child in the entire country is benefiting from. So for me, I think we need to reorient our society towards a more human-centered development.
Could I wait?
Senator, before we come to you, because I was actually going to come to you, we have a caller. Elvis, you're calling in from Nairobi. Good morning. How are you?
I'm very well. Good morning, Susan.
All right, go ahead, please. What's your comment or question into the conversation that we're having here in studio?
Oh yeah, my issue is about this borrow, which does not make sense to me. And actually, to me and I think to every Kenyan.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, because I think when I go to bank, I'm borrowing some money. I'm borrowing that money for a project. I need to borrow my money so that I can buy some land.
Right.
Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, whatever you borrow, it's interested, and you need to pay that back.
Okay. All right, that's a fantastic comment. Thank you so much, Elvis, right there. Elvis saying whatever we borrow, we need to bring back. Senator Kajwang, let me just draw your attention back to our very first caller. There's something he talked about, poor governance, which is simply poor management. So is the problem the system or the individuals? If we got rid of the system and replace it with a new system, but the individuals are the same, will we see a different return? Or if the system stayed, but we changed individuals, would we see better management, better governance?
I believe you're right. There are two types of common borrowers in Kenya. Let's leave the government aside for a while. These mobile money platforms, who borrows from them? There is the borrowing that happens at 4 a.m. in Marikiti or in our various markets. There is a loan taken at 4 a.m. By 10 a.m. it has been repaid, and someone has made a profit. There is also the kind of borrowing that takes place at 8 p.m. And it is a borrowing that is done to buy a whiskey or to buy drinks. And these are the people who are at the highest risk of default. Okay. If Kenya was an individual, I would place it not at the 4 a.m. category, but at the 8 p.m. category. Because we borrow irresponsibly. We borrow for projects that we can't show. We borrow for projects where even if they are delivered, there are elements of kickbacks, there's a whiff of corruption. And I'm not making this up. A few cabinet secretaries have gone to Kiambu Road, where the president told them to go to, next to Karura Forest. They have recorded statements. The DCI pursuing issues of kickback, is pursuing the trail of monies paid for construction of dams, but found its way back into the country to buy towels and to buy other things. Okay. So the caller is absolutely right that greed, kickbacks is a problem when it comes to borrowing. Okay. But for me, the second other thing is KRA has been given a target of about 1.8 trillion in terms of tax collection for this coming financial year. But we have a 3 trillion budget. So you already see we have a deficit of almost 1.2 trillion. But research has indicated that tax avoidance and tax evasion cost this country lots of money. And I can tell you, many of the big business people in this country, there are few that pay their taxes diligently. But many people in this country, given a choice, they will not pay tax. Why? Because they are not getting services in return. We must examine our capability to raise revenue locally, and for us to raise revenue locally, we must provide an incentive for people doing business in this country. We must provide corresponding services. All right. Finally, Parliament is supposed to look at issues of debt. In fact, that's why the debt management strategy is supposed to come to Parliament, not just for national governments, but for county governments as well. I keep saying that Parliament has not lived up to its billing and expectation in terms of budgeting and debt management, and we think that once Rotich has made a decision, then that decision has been taken, it is final. Okay. We still have a role, particularly in the National Assembly, where my brother Gachagua sits, to scrutinize these things and put the government to task on its irresponsible borrowing. We'll be shortly closing on this argument. Before we do that, not argument, but discussion. Joseph from Nairobi, you're calling. What's your question? Good morning.
Mine is just a comment. I think I just want to agree with what has been said there. But me, the key one here is the governance. Simply because the issues which we have in is because we are people who are doing what they want to do and they are not accountable to anybody. Whether it's Rotich or whoever it is, we know that all this money is being borrowed because of the incentive is the kickbacks. Right. But nobody is taking action on it. Again, we have become competitive in our production because the inputs have been brought by entrepreneurs who exaggerate, given the fertilizer, the rest. So the cost of production for the farmers, if even I'm a farmer because I do the farming, I'm not even able, the cost of production is too high simply because of the input, because somebody has been allowed by the government to bring input at an inflated cost. The third thing is that even the legislation which Mr. the people near whatever he's talking about, this the decision which was being done on the daily, they were done by, we can see even from where I sit, by the manufacturers. Simply because a lot of the issues which are happening in the country are coming from the entrepreneurs. Today they might ban, you see there was a plastic bag, whatever. Somebody want to ban them so that already we have somebody who is there to provide.